As we turn towards the end of the book of Revelation, we come across this very strange passage about the millennium. And actually the millennium, it's a number as well, and often people have the same feeling about this as they do about the way numbers are used generally in the book of Revelation, which is that some people focus on it and they say, oh, this is the most important thing, and they talk about the millennium endlessly, and they speculate as to whether the millennium is about to be here, and so on. Others, for that reason, because other people are so obsessed with it, they say, actually, I don't want anything to do with this. It's just too complicated. It's very strange. And the millennium is often associated with a particular way of reading the book of Revelation, and that is that it's a detached prediction of future events which are separate from the rest of the New Testament. I hope by now you've seen some reasons why that's not a helpful way to read the book as a whole. Because it would mean, for example, that it had no significance at all to the Christians to whom John was writing. And that would be very odd, number one. Number two, in that case, why would it have found its way into the New Testament? The books gathered together in the New Testament weren't necessarily originally written as scripture, but Christians had a sense that the way that God has spoken to them through their scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, now God is also speaking to them, particularly about Jesus, in these other stories, Gospels, letters, and the book of Revelation. So unless it said something to them very specifically about their own time and about the good news of Jesus, and it actually enabled them to live their lives faithfully, it wouldn't have got in here at all. So to treat this as simply for John some distant forecast of the future that's only relevant to us is actually, when you think about it, quite a strange way of dealing with the book. There are a number of other things we need to think about when we come to read the Millennium. The first is, people often say, well, this is about some future period of a literal 1,000 years. And again, I find that very puzzling. If by now we haven't realised that Revelation is full of symbolism and full of symbolic meaning, and that it uses numbers and images and ideas and verses from the Old Testament in theological and symbolic ways, why would we treat this number alone as literal? We've come across the 144,000 in chapter 7, and actually most people would say that's a symbol of the people of God. The numbers don't count out exactly who's involved, unless you're a Jehovah's Witness. They actually give some significance, some symbolic significance to the people. We're going to look in chapter 21 at the New Jerusalem, and it's got a symbolic size. It's not a literal size. It tells us something about the presence of God with his people. So given the symbolic use of numbers, why would we alone take the millennium to be a literal period of time? I think it's much more convincing to say, well, John's doing what he does elsewhere. He's borrowing an idea from elsewhere in his culture and his understanding, and he's using that and adapting that to tell us something about who the person of Jesus is. In this case, I think he's borrowing an idea which was well known amongst the rabbis, the Jewish teachers in Jesus' day, where they saw the whole world, the history of the world, as corresponding to the creation of the world in Genesis 1 and 2. So in the same way that God created the world in 6 days and had a seventh day of rest, so the world itself continues through 6 ages, and finally when the Messiah comes, it has a seventh age which corresponds to God's day of rest. So there'll come a time when, in all the strugglings and strivings of this world, there'll come a day when God actually sets all things right, and we can finally enter the rest that is promised to us. And of course the writer of the Hebrews uses exactly that language. He says, now in Jesus we can enter that promised era of rest. It anticipates the age that is to come, the age of the New Jerusalem. It's also worth paying careful attention to this particular section of the book of Revelation and the way that John writes. And here actually the chapter divisions aren't helping us. The millennium comes at the beginning of chapter 20, and we turn over the page in our New Testament and we see, this is a new chapter. We think this must be detached from what comes before. In fact, the chapter divisions, they were invented in the 13th century, actually by an Archbishop of Canterbury. So, the Church of England doesn't get everything wrong. But they were added to the text to help us find our way through it. And they're not always a reliable guide to where John himself is changing subject and changing focus. In fact, that comes earlier on at the end of chapter 18. If you look carefully through this section, you'll find that there are 7 times where John says, and I saw a rider on a white horse, and I saw a great white throne, and I saw this vision of the millennium, and he goes on, and I saw the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth. In fact, this section belongs to part of the series of 7 unnumbered visions. And the question is, what are they doing? Are they offering us a sequence of events one after the other, or are they offering us 7 different perspectives on the same event? And that event is Jesus finally returning to this world, the world that he'd been to, the world that he'd created. John chapter 1 tells us, the world which he was due to return to. All the way through the New Testament is an expectation that one day Jesus will return. It's an expectation that Jesus talks about, it's an expectation that that Paul has in his writings, and it's an expectation that John here gives us. Now the question is Jesus going to come back and then go away and come back and go away and come back and go away? Because if you read chapters 19, 20, 21, as it were, literally, that's what it seems to say. Or is John doing something that he's done all the way through this book, which is to say, look, I want to explain something to you. Let me talk to you about it this way. Or let me talk to you about it this way. Or let me give you a new insight. You haven't understood it. Let me talk about it this way. And he begins to fill in the picture in more and more detail to tell us different things about the same event. He's already done that in structure throughout the book of Revelation. So we had first of all we had a series of messages to the 7 congregations, and then we had the vision of worship in heaven, and then we had this series of 7 seals, which seemed to tell us about how the world is and what God's going to do about it, and how in the end he's going to wrap it up and bring it to its final conclusion. Then we had a bit of an interlude about what the people of God looked like in chapter 7. Then we had another 7 series of trumpets. What do? Well, they tell us the same thing, but in a bit more detail. How the world is, what God's going to do about it, how the end is going to come. And then we have another interlude, chapters 10 and 11. And then we have another way of talking about it, this vision of the woman in pain of labour and the male child and so on. Then we get another series of 7s, which rehearses the way the world is, what God's going to do about it, how it's going to come to an end. So John is always coming back and saying, look, let me tell it to you in another way. And I think that's what he's doing here. So the millennium should fit with the other 6 visions around it and say, look, this isn't that Jesus is going to come back and go away and come back and go away. This is using 7 different ways, 7 different sets of language to tell us what the end would look like and what will happen when God finally brings this age of suffering to an end, and finally Jesus returns to take his rightful place as Lord of this world that he's created, this world that has turned from him, but this world which finally he'll restore, he'll bring just judgment to. Finally, he will eliminate the very presence of evil and sin, and finally we will be in his presence forever. So that's a really important, just a framework for understanding the millennium. And what kind of things does the millennium tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that God will in the end win the victory. The defeat of evil will be real. The despair and the suffering that we see in this world will be brought to an end. And actually the victory of God will come through the ruling of Jesus. Just as we saw earlier on that the one who is on the throne, the Creator, is joined by the Lamb. So actually God shares his authority with Jesus, the Lamb who was slain for us. And in fact, right at the very beginning, the future of God is in the coming of Jesus. God is, instead of Old Testament terms, being the one who was and is and who will be, God was and will come again in the person of Jesus. The future of God's sovereignty on the earth is actually made manifest in the return of Jesus himself. Secondly, it establishes Jesus as Lord, not just in theory, but actually in practice, over the powers of evil. So it's Jesus himself who binds Satan and defeats the force of evil, just as he's done on the cross. Now he does so in the world itself. Thirdly, it teaches us that along with the victory of Jesus comes the vindication of the saints, those who cried under the altar in chapter 6, "How long, O Lord, until our death is avenged?" How long until the world actually sees that we were being faithful to you, even though we were despised, even though we suffered for our faith, even though we lost our lives for you, and that looked like the public testimony about who we are. In fact, one day we will be publicly vindicated before the very people by whom we were publicly humiliated. And the last one is actually quite important, again very important for our age, which is that the future of the world is its redemption and its restoration. It's not that this tired old creation is going to be dispensed with, but actually, as promised earlier, God will destroy the destroyers of the earth. This creation, this world we live in, belongs to God. It's God's good world, and actually those who destroy it and damage it, God will judge, and he will restore the created order. Our destiny is not a disembodied existence as spirits with God in some ethereal heaven. Our destiny is bodily resurrection in a renewed and a restored creation.